Thank you. Judi Brazkiewicz, Federation of Small Businesses. I run a small business in the first aid training sector. A couple of issues I'd like to ask, particularly Karen's input. How do we level the playing field? I'm a small business. I am my HR department. I am my finance department. I am my quality assurance department. I am my business. I don't have time to chase things like late payment, which is quite often from bigger providers. There's a number of issues going on for small businesses with late payment, obviously. The bigger the provider, the worse they appear to be. And even within government contracts and procurement, the original contractor gets paid within a reasonable part of time, but we're usually lower down the food chain for those, and we can be 60 or more days before we get paid. And I don't know about other small businesses, but I don't have that cash flow ability to wear that. And the other thing, we keep getting promised that life's going to be made easier for us. In my own industry, the Health and Safety Executive has recently just removed themselves from approval and monitoring of training providers. But on every piece of paperwork and advice they have put out to employers for future first aid training, they are pushing the voluntary sector or the off-qual route. And neither of those work well for independent training providers. We need an industry body, which we are trying to get going, but nobody will recognise that outside of, on the higher echelons of the industry. How do we level the playing field?
All right, madam. Two issues there. Let's deal with cash flow and finance first, because this is something I hear week in, week out on my show. Big companies squeezing small ones, and they don't really care about them. What's the experience in America?
Jeff, I'm very happy to say I actually have a proposed solution for that we implemented in the US. And it really came about because the financial crisis was squeezing the cash flow so much. We could only make up so much in borrowings. And so what we decided is that in the US, the amount of government contracts that go to small business is $100 billion a year. What if the government paid, instead of in 30 days, in 15 days? How much cash flow would that bring? And so we proposed this. I actually only proposed 30 days down to 20 days, figuring at least we get it on time. And the president said, no, how about 15 days? We'll cut it in half. And so we implemented this, and at the time it was relatively cost-free to the federal government because borrowing rates were very low. So the government was able to provide huge amounts of security and certainty and cash flow into small business contractors. Then we said, what about the subcontractors of the large businesses? So we instituted a policy where the large contractors to the federal government, particularly in the military, are evaluated on how fast they pay their subcontractors, and they are required to pay in 15 days. So that has now flowed through the system, and I was visiting a small business in South Carolina, and I asked the woman who ran an engineering components business for the military what difference it made to her, and she said it avoided having to take out another cash flow loan for working capital. And I will say that the press, when we announced this, said, wait a minute, you're going to pay small business the same amount just 15 days earlier? What good is that? And every small business in the room said, well, wait a minute, let me explain it to you. So it was not,
right. So that's,
the value was not
that's
as
the
well
role
understood.
that government can play, and of course government is often a very big buyer. But what about corporations that you supply? I mean, what's your experience, Rebecca? Because what I hear is that corporations, big corporations, the multinationals of this world, in effect bully their small suppliers. They know that the small suppliers need them. They're a drop in the bucket. They pay when they feel like it. But of course, at the other end of the chain, the small suppliers running out of money. What's your experience with Pistachio Rose?
Having worked on both sides, so at Amazon previously, absolutely every private corporation wants to maximise their cash flow. Personally, I suppose I had the foresight to build that in.
What, you expected them to be bad payers?
Yeah.
And were they?
No, but the terms weren't as favourable as I would have liked. But I built that in. But I think that it's a huge challenge for a lot of businesses. And what that really comes down to is how can they have more flexibility around their working capital? One of the things I really liked out of the SBA was the microfinance loans. So it's up to $35,000, but one of the purposes is for working capital. Now, I realise that some may not be relevant for all businesses, but I think that that's quite a nice solution that would meet a need in the market.
Francis, any thoughts on this? Because I would imagine this is a problem for many, many people in this room, being squeezed for cash. I mean, when you looked at the bankruptcy stats during the early part of the recession, lots of small companies were going bust, not because their business was failing, simply because they weren't being paid.
I would agree with what Karen Enrica has to say in many respects. I think that there is profound issues about late payment. I'm not sure that the government can do much more than actually act as an exemplar or best practice. So it can lead the way. But I think going back to what Karen had to say about clusters, what we need is supply chains that are a bit more integrated, so there's levels of trust between large and small businesses, so that can flow down. And if we have those stable, almost Germanic supply relationships, then in some respects that may alleviate some of the problems. But I think overall I'd be nervous about intervening too much in this space, because I think we've got to let markets work as effectively as possible.
Well, before we move on, let's put that point to Chuka. If in 2015 you sweep to glorious victory, as no doubt you believe you will, what promise can a Labour government give small business about payments from government? The Karen point.
Well, I mean, I think that the late payment of small businesses by their large suppliers, public or private, is an absolute disgrace, and it is a national scandal. And I think that I'm not sure I completely agree, actually, with what's just been said, in the sense that I do think government can do something here. First of all, being a better customer. And that means not only ensuring that, I think we left in place a requirement that departments pay within 10 days or sooner. And actually part of the challenge for government is to make sure that that applies all the way down supply chains in contracts. And that is not being implemented at the moment. So that's one thing that government can do. The bigger challenge, which I don't pretend to have a full answer to yet, but is what I'm hoping we can do, is the issue that everybody in this room has is you don't want to get into a big row with your customers, right? And ultimately, you need a system. Now, we tried through the Late Payment Act to, for example, provide for default interest rates, etc. But what we need to build is a system that builds in a degree of automaticity so you don't have to have the row, and so that there is a sanction or some kind of adverse consequence that applies for the large suppliers. And that is what we're working on trying to find a solution to. But people need to know, particularly these large suppliers, and actually the private sector is a much worse offender than the public sector here. It isn't acceptable. It's totally unacceptable. And what I'm discerning at the moment is, in terms of finance, I would say, cash flow and this late payment issue is as big now for businesses, small businesses, as actually being able to get access to finance in the first place.